Good morning. All right.
Morning.
How's everybody? Warming up? Well, I like all 4 seasons. I used to live in Arizona, which you have 1 season, well, maybe 2, warm and warmer. So what I'd like to do for today, Cadillac discussion, ketogenic diets, volume and velocity for our restrictive factors to lead by, and then finish chapter 4 and begin chapter 6. So any questions? Okay, let's dive right in. So what's a ketogenic diet? Have a definition for it? Ketogenic diet. What are some things you would associate with a ketogenic diet? What are macronutrients like? Low carbs, high protein. Okay, low carbs. We'll get there. What level of carbohydrates generally puts you in a state of ketosis? Yes. How many grams? So what was cited in the article, it said less than 50 grams per day is generally low enough in quantity to put you in a state of ketosis. So less than 50 grams a day would be like 2 bananas, and that's it for your carbs for the whole day. And so the definition of ketosis is a metabolic state in which the body generates energy from ketone bodies rather than glucose at a rate capable of fueling the brain and the body. Where do we store carbohydrates in the body? A couple places. Yeah, liver. Okay, that's good. Skeletal muscle. Makes sense. That's a good place to have carbohydrate stores because our muscles use a lot of that energy. In physiology, we oftentimes say that fat burns in the flame of carbohydrates. So in order to have effective fat metabolism, we have to have what's called carbohydrate intermediates. But if we don't have enough glucose, so we run out of carbohydrate stores because of insufficient carbohydrate intake or fasting or in cases of starvation, our body has to rely on another way of accessing those fatty acids. So in this case, in the liver, is where we make ketone bodies within the mitochondria of cells in the liver. So if we don't have sufficient glucose, we convert fatty acids into ketone bodies. Do you remember the 3 ketone bodies that were mentioned? Yes? Good. Good. Yes! Good. Beta hydroxybutyrate. Beta hydroxybutyrate, acetone, and acetoacetic acid. So there were 3. Let me just say those again. The main ketone bodies, acetoacetate, ACE-TO, ACE-TATAE, acetoacetate. Beta hydroxybutyrate, beta and then hydroxy with a Y, butyrate with a Y, and then acetone. So those 3. So once those ketone bodies are made in the liver, they are shuttled into the bloodstream where they can be taken up by cells throughout the body, especially the brain and skeletal muscle, and used as a substitute for glucose, which is nice. Our bodies have a tremendous capacity to fuel activities, regardless of whether we have carbohydrates present or not. So it would make sense that over time, with a lack of carbohydrates, and in the article, it says 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks is where your body tends to adapt and make these changes over 2 to 3 weeks time. And so you become more efficient at using fatty acids. So all of those enzymes in the mitochondria of cells that are involved with fat burning, we would see increases. Okay, so that it sounds like a good thing, especially if you're trying to improve your body composition, right? The first author that was making the point more in support of ketogenic diet, pointed out an excellent study by Bolick. Let me just summarize here. Bolick demonstrated in comparing a ketogenic diet versus a normal carbohydrate diet in elite ultra marathoners and Ironman triathletes. So when compared with their traditional carbohydrate intake, elite athletes consuming 10% carbohydrate diet showed a 2-fold increase in peak fat oxidation, as well as a 59% increase in mean fat oxidation during submaximal exercise. So that makes sense. If you have a lack of carbohydrates, your body gets better at using fatty acids. Fatty acids from triglycerides. So triglycerides have how many fatty acids? Tri means 3. So that's our storage form of fat in the body. So we have this upregulation in our ability to use fat. In terms of anaerobic athletes, so strength and power type athletes, another study showed no difference in resistance training induced strength gains or muscle thickness, okay, so that would be hypertrophy, between a ketogenic diet and a standard diet when equated for total calories. So if we're restricting our diet to less than 50 grams of carbohydrate a day, maybe less than 10% of our total calories, and we're getting into this state of ketosis, what is actually defined as ketosis? What concentration of ketone bodies in the blood would constitute ketosis? So we're starting to get over into the second author's point here. Morning, Stephen. Morning. Glad you made it. What level of ketone bodies in the blood? And I believe if you're trying out this approach, you can measure it with ketone sticks, I believe. Because you don't want to get into a state of extreme ketosis because it can be life-threatening. But we're talking about mild ketosis. And so the figure that was stated in an article, ketone levels between 0.5 and 3.0 millimoles per liter. So you'll want to remember that. 0.5 to 3 millimoles per liter is considered a state of ketosis. So a ketogenic diet is often associated with a very high protein intake. also a higher fat intake, because we've got to fill our caloric allotment with other macronutrients. So higher fat, higher protein intake. The figure cited from the article, 2.8 grams per kilogram, which is pretty high. If you calculate that for yourself, if you know what your body mass is in kilograms, and then you multiply that by 2.8, that would give you the grams of protein per day. And that's quite a bit. Anybody know what the recommended dietary allowance is, just for the average non-physically active individual? Yeah, 0.8 is pretty low, 0.8 grams per kilogram. So we're talking over 3.5 times the RDA in protein. So you better include some fiber with that, right? So the second author does make some important points, especially on the practicality of following a ketogenic diet. You athletes that go on road trips, is it more challenging on the road to maintain consistent nutrient intake? All those hours on the bus. So what do you have in your backpack, right? Cheez-Its, right? Okay, it's tough. It's tough on the road to maintain consistency in your macronutrients. So practicality can be a limitation of this approach. One of the things the second author brought up that I really liked is periodization of nutrition. How many of you have heard of that concept? Yeah, so we have periodization of physical conditioning, so why not periodization of nutrient intake? So the second author was more an advocate of maybe during off-season periods, when we have a little more time to focus on body recomposition following a ketogenic diet, that might be the best time. Whereas in-season periods, you're doing a lot of high-intensity work, so maybe a traditional moderate to high carbohydrate diet was the recommendation. So he referred to this as metabolic flexibility. I like that concept, metabolic flexibility. So if you think about that, metabolic flexibility. So our body's ability to use a variety of fuel sources to meet the demands of activity. And so maybe with a periodized nutrition approach, we practice a ketogenic diet during off-season periods. We're really working on trying to build as much muscle and lose as much body fat as we can, which a ketogenic diet would definitely help with that. And then as we progress closer to the in-season, we are providing our bodies with more carbohydrates because our activity levels need that support for high-intensity activity. Our bodies really like to use carbohydrates and really like to have glucose readily available for high-intensity activity. So any questions or comments? How many of you have ever tried a ketogenic diet? Okay, I have during different periods, and it worked really well. But then as soon as I was done with what I was training for, I went back to a normal diet because it's hard to maintain for long term. Very difficult.
Was the initial stage kind of rough? Like, were you tired?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
First couple of weeks of it?
I would do 3 days of a very low carbohydrate ketogenic type diet, but then on every 4th day, I would reload carbohydrates just because I couldn't.
No, so.
I had to be able to work. So, yeah. Okay, so, yes,
Little cheat.
yeah. Yeah, good carbohydrates, but more carbohydrates. So, okay. So I'll post another article for Monday, probably later today. Do you like the nutrition ones or supplementation ones, exercise ones? What do you want to read about? You have a preference? Anything timely? You want a supplement one? Okay. Throw one up for Monday. Okay. So next item on the agenda, prescriptive factors. So our prescriptive factors, we've talked about so far just intensity. And how did we define intensity? Intensity in a resistance training context. The percentage of what? Yeah, percentage of 1 RM. So the load. So we have two different ways, a percent of 1 RM or a repetition maximum. And so the point was made that at 85% of a 1 rep max, that's equivalent to maybe about a 6 repetition maximum. So there's different ways of expressing percent 1 RM versus just repetition maximum. So at 87% of 1 RM, it would be down to about 5 repetitions maximum. Kind of depends on the exercise. We tend to have a greater number of repetitions for lower body exercises for a given percent of 1 RM versus upper body exercises. So for example, at 87% of 1 RM on a squat, we might be able to get 7 repetitions maximum. Whereas on a bench press, it might be only 5 or 6. So why do we naturally exhibit a little more endurance with lower body muscles at the same relative intensity? Why do you think? What muscles are you using to get from one place to another all day long? Yeah, so that's why we walk around. And so those muscles naturally have a little bit more endurance to them. Okay, so looking at volume now. Volume and intensity go hand in hand, because if we're looking at a periodized program, as intensity goes up, what should happen to volume? Volume goes down. So there's an inverse relationship to this. How do we define volume then? What factors would go into calculating volume? Yes? Okay. That's a good start. Okay, I'd like to add one more to that. Load. So that's the definition of volume. Load times sets times reps. So it's essentially a measure of how much work or stress that you're applying to your body during the course of a workout. Load times sets times reps. So if you calculate that all the way through, you come up with the total amount of pounds you lifted during a workout. So just a very simple example, simple math. So 100 pounds, 5 sets, 10. What would be your total pounds, or what would be the total volume? Yeah, 5,000 pounds. So that represents a marker of the amount of work that your muscles are doing, the amount of stress that your body is exposed to. So the amount of volume that we do, especially in the off season, is going to go up. Okay, whereas as we get closer to the in season, the amount of volume goes down because intensity and quality of effort become more of a priority during in season. So along with volume, we have to consider this dose-response relationship, and Brady and Shelby, you've heard yesterday in research meeting, and Allie talked about the dose response. A dose response. So, apologize, you have to hear this again. We can liken exercise to medicine. Medication has a dose-response relationship. So taking in a certain dose is expected to produce a certain response or outcome. Just like with exercise, applying a certain dose or a certain volume, load times reps times sets, is expected to produce a certain outcome. So what outcomes do we have? We're going back to our foundational characteristics: strength, power, hypertrophy, localized endurance. Okay, and we hope that the way that we train for those characteristics has a transfer effect to our sport. So the way that we address strength, power, hypertrophy, and endurance should be in a way that simulates what we're doing for our sport. Okay, so rather than sitting on a leg press, we do ground-based lifts that involve multiple muscle groups, that involve the coordinated activation of muscles across multiple joints, because those ground-based lifts are more similar to what we do as part of our sport. So, is the dose of medication the same for everybody? No. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. And I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm sure that body weight and medical history goes into that. Okay, for exercise, do we give the same dose to everybody? No. Okay, so what are some factors we have to consider? What if you're working with someone that's never lifted a weight? Are you going to give them the same dose of training that you would give Nolan? No, we run into lots of problems. How many have heard of rhabdomyolysis? Okay, there's a lot of reports about people that aren't prepared for a certain dose of exercise, and then they have all of this muscle damage that overwhelms the filtration capacity of their kidneys, and it's a life-threatening condition. So even in a trained individual, we can't be careless about the dose of exercise. So the dose that you would give an untrained individual is different than the dose that you would give a trained person. It's really nice in the beginning for an untrained person because you give them just a little bit of dose, just a little bit of weight training, and what happens? They get all this gain, okay? So I did a study once on this exact concept. I took a population of untrained, middle-aged women that had never lifted weights. And they did a total of about 2 sets per week. So I wanted to see just how much of a dose That didn't include warm-up sets, so that was 2 good sets to failure. Guess what happened after 10 weeks in these untrained people? They increased strength force output about 60%. So how do we account for that, given what we've talked about in chapter 4? What's going on? There wasn't much change in muscle mass, by the way. Yeah. They're activating motor units that were formerly inhibited by the brain. So the brain was inhibiting these motor units from being activated. All of a sudden you put them under load and the brain releases these motor units so they can use more of their available muscle. So just a tiny dose for an untrained person can produce tremendous results. That doesn't seem to last though, does it? Wouldn't that be nice if it continued to be like that? So now, after maybe 5 to 10 years, you have to give yourself a lot more dose to get just a little bit more gain. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, why would the brain restrict those responses or anything like that? Was it a protective mechanism
Yes.
of muscles or?
Yeah. What type of tissue connects your muscles to your bones? You've got tendons, right? You've got ligaments that connect your bones together at your joints. So using all available muscle mass at one time can do a lot of damage if your connective tissue is not prepared for it. So your brain protects us by slowly releasing those motor units as we become strong enough to use them. So, all right, so even for a trained lifter, just a small gain in your 1RM, 10-pound gain in your 1RM, you feel pretty good about that. Don't you, Bryn? Your bench press goes up 10 pounds and you feel pretty good about that because you've been training for a long time. So as your training experience grows, you have to put in increasingly more, we could say the dose is the work, for just a little bit more of a response, a little bit more of an adaptation. And so we have lots of meta-analyses that have quantified the dose-response relationship. It turns out that what the literature says is for an untrained person, you can do pretty well just on one set to failure. But after a period of time, certainly you have to give yourself a lot more work to get just a little bit of gain. Okay, so next one, let's talk about velocity. Velocity. So which of our 4 foundational characteristics would you associate most with velocity? How fast you're moving the bar. Yeah, power is right. So power, in fact, is calculated by taking force times velocity. So we have a neat little tool that we do biomechanics labs with that we can attach to the bar and we can measure how fast the bar moves, and by multiplying the weight of the bar by the velocity of the bar, we can estimate power. So we're talking about repetition velocity. So there's an inverse relationship between the load and the velocity. As the load goes up, velocity goes down. Okay, and vice versa. But what I want to talk about with this one specifically is actual velocity versus intended. So think about those two things for a minute. Actual velocity versus intended velocity. What's the difference? So if you're lifting a very heavy weight, what's your actual velocity going to be like? Relatively slow, right? Okay, but could our intended velocity still be pretty quick? Yeah, so can you lift a heavy weight with the intention of moving it quickly? Yeah. So, especially when power is the goal, if the weight is light, then our actual velocity is going to be very fast. If the weight is heavy, our actual velocity is going to be slow, but the intention could be to move the heavy weight quickly. Really important. In fact, there's a group of Canadians that have actually examined this concept in terms of neural adaptations. So one group lifting very light weight where the actual velocity was very fast. Another group lifting heavy weight where people were instructed to, with the intention of moving it as quickly as possible. Guess what happened? Guess what neurological changes were found in each group? They were the same in terms of conduction velocity, conduction of the action potential. So actual velocity or intended velocity to a certain degree produces the same changes in the nervous system. So whether we're lifting heavy or whether we're lifting light, if the goal is power, we want the intention to move that weight as quickly as possible because it results in similar changes in things like rate of force development, acceleration, those desirable qualities that we want for an athlete. Okay, so any questions about volume or velocity? Volume or velocity? You know how volume is defined. Okay. You know about the importance of velocity. Okay, all right, so with that, let's get back into chapter 4. We'll finish that up today. Let's see. Okay. So skeletal muscle architecture. Architecture, I like that word. When we train, we remodel our muscles. So our muscles change in response to training. Fascicle length can increase in response to training, especially heavy negative type muscle actions. So what are we talking about with a negative? What type of muscle action is that? Eccentric. Heavy eccentric type muscle actions tend to increase the length of fascicles. What's a fascicle? Let's go back. What's a fascicle? Handful of spaghetti example. What is it? A fascicle. Yeah, it's a bundle of muscle fibers. And from what we know in chapter 4, do muscle fibers go all the way from one attachment point to the other? No, they don't. Okay, so most muscle fibers are pretty short. So between one attachment point and the other, from the origin to the insertion, you can have maybe 2 or 3 muscle fibers that are connected end to end all the way down to the insertion. So that's important because the application is we need to do full range of motion. Partial range of motion, we may only be getting a small percentage of those muscle fibers. So fascicle length tends to increase. So we'll show you an example of an exercise here in a moment. pennation angle tends to increase. Pennation angle, that's the angle where the fibers attach to the tendon. As pennation angle increases, we also have an increase in what's called physiological cross-sectional area. Physiological cross-sectional area. So as pennation angle increases, we have an increased volume of muscle. Muscle becomes more dense and compact and able to produce more force. So a highly pennated muscle would increase its force production with training. So let's pull this out to the practical realm. So I said fascicle length increases with training. How many have done something like this exercise? This is excellent, excellent exercise. I wish we had a machine exactly like that. But, okay, so I said heavy negatives. So you're asking someone to help you with the lifting part, and then you're doing the lowering part all the way from here down to the bottom. So that'd be a good way to increase the fascicle length in the hamstring. So your hamstrings actually get just a little bit longer. Fascicle length increases. Longer hamstrings. Longer hamstrings able to tolerate higher amounts of stress, which is good to avoid hamstring injuries. Doing something like this, especially the negative part, with more weight than we can lift, so heavy negatives, would be an excellent way to reduce the risk of hamstring pulls. Your hamstrings get more tolerant to being under tension. Okay, so this is just a picture. If you're having a hard time visualizing what pennation angle means, this is pennation angle right here. This is the vastus lateralis. So you have a tendon up here, and you have a tendon down here, and then these are the fibers that you can see running in this direction. So the pennation angle is this angle right here between the tendon and the fiber direction. Okay, so moving on, length tension relationship. So muscles produce various amounts of tension based on their length. So it all has to do with the amount of overlap between actin and myosin. So those two myofilaments. So the amount of force you produce is directly proportional to the connection between actin and myosin. So the more cross bridges between actin and myosin, the more force our muscles can produce. So here's a key point. When muscles are under just a little bit of stretch, so slightly greater than resting length, is where we have the most connections between actin and myosin. So let me give you a practical example. So with a counter movement jump, it's how we jump most of the time. We have a quick squat and then a takeoff. So there's a load phase, sometimes called a preparatory phase. The muscles undergo a quick stretch as we undergo this quick squat, and then we reverse it into a jump. So the quick squat provides just a little bit of stretch to our jumping muscles. So one of multiple reasons we jump higher with a counter movement jump is because the muscles have a quick stretch. So that puts more actin and myosin together to create force. So we undergo a quick stretch, actin and myosin connect, and then we put more force into the ground, and the ground does what? Puts the force back into us, and we jump higher. Typically during a counter movement jump, we jump about 10 to 30% higher than we do during a squat jump. So what is a squat jump? Biomechanics people.
Pause at the bottom of the squat
Yes.
and then jump.
Yeah, so you're squatting down, pausing. So what you're doing is you're allowing all that elasticity to dissipate as heat. And then it's just the contractile component that's pushing you off the ground. So the difference is you don't have that quick stretch. You don't have that quick load phase prior to the takeoff phase. Okay, so this is just a figure from your textbook, chapter 6, chapter 4 in your textbook, that shows you the percentage of muscle length. So the percentage of muscle length. So over here, the muscle would be contracted and shortened. Over here, the muscle would be very stretched out. And so what these little figures represent is the amount of overlap between actin and myosin. So within each muscle cell, you would have the most connections right here. Just maybe a little bit greater than resting length, maybe 110%, 10% of a stretch, you would get the most connection. So that would affect force output. Okay, force-velocity relationship. So the amount of force muscles produce is related to the speed of contraction. So in absolute terms, not relative terms, but absolute terms, the amount of force a muscle produces is dependent on how fast the contraction takes place. So high force is developed with slow contractions. Low force is associated with fast contractions in absolute terms. So I'm not talking about the level of exertion, because regardless, exertion is maximal. So I'm talking about the amount of force output in absolute terms. So for concentric muscle actions, for lifting weight, the heavier the weight, the slower the contraction is all we're saying. Heavier weight, the slower the contraction. The lighter the weight, the faster the contraction. So it makes sense. The more load that you have on the bar, the slower that contraction velocity is going to be. The slower the muscles are going to shorten. The lesser load all the way down to your body weight, the faster the muscles are going to contract. So what we say is the force-velocity relationship for concentric muscle actions is inverse. Inverse means that as force goes up, velocity goes down. Force goes down, velocity goes up. Okay, eccentric actions are a little bit different. Eccentric actions, the faster the tension, or I guess faster the contraction, the more force is produced. So what I like to think about is dropping from a box. So biomechanics students, we did this this week, actually, though some of you have already done this. Dropping from a box. Okay. So you drop from a box, gravity accelerates your body to the ground, your feet hit the ground with a certain amount of impact force. So as the height of that drop is progressively increased, what happens to the impact force when you hit the ground? As the height of the box goes up, the impact force also goes up, right? As the impact force goes up, what happens to velocity as you hit the ground? As the height of the box gets progressively higher, how does that change your velocity on impact? It also goes up. So eccentric type actions are proportional. The higher the force, the higher the velocity. Higher the velocity, the higher the force. And so on. So isometric actions are kind of in the middle. So you've got concentric all the way down to zero velocity, which at zero velocity, you're not moving. So what type of muscle action is that? You have the isometric. So you have a certain amount of force there, and then as we go from isometric into eccentric, force goes up even further. So what do you need to remember? You need to remember that the relationship for force and velocity is inverse for concentric actions. The relationship between force and velocity is proportional for eccentric actions. So proportional, as velocity goes up, force also goes up. We tend to be a lot stronger with eccentric actions. So an important practical point is when implementing traditional loading modes for resistance training, the eccentric muscle action is insufficiently loaded because resistance is based on concentric strength. So in practice, is there anything we can do to perhaps increase the demand during the eccentric part? If we're doing traditional repetitions, lowering and lifting, is there any practical method we could use to increase the load on the eccentric part?
Lower, slower.
Yeah, so more time under tension. Yes, maybe how many have had a training partner apply pressure on the bar, maybe during a bench press? So as you're lowering the bar during a bench press, you could apply some downward pressure, take that pressure away, and then have them lift the bar with their own strength. So they make some pretty nice equipment nowadays. How many have seen weight releasers? So weight releasers do exactly that, don't they? They allow you to use more load during the eccentric part, and then the weight is released at the bottom, so you have to set the height of the weight releaser based on your range of motion. So when you're at your chest on a bench press, you'd want that weight releaser to be exactly set so that it would release. So you can see this little tool out here, and it kind of has a slanted base to it. So as this person lowers down to their chest, they reach their chest, and then because of the slanted base, it automatically comes off the bar. And then they can just push that up with concentric strength. So neat tools that you can use to, based on the science, knowing that you're a little bit stronger with the eccentric part, you can provide a little more load during that part.
Is that like the chains too? To do something like that with the chains? Is that similar to that concept?
Chains, you're getting less resistance at the bottom,
Okay.
and then more resistance through the top, which is good, but I'm not sure you're getting more through the lowering part.
So these are for stability muscles more so kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah, so there's lots of additional implements you can attach to bars, chains and bands, and all kinds of things. They even have bamboo bars that vibrate a little bit. So all kinds of things in practice that are really intended to do what? To create more motor unit activity. So you're getting more muscle recruited during a set. So something like this would help you get more motor unit recruitment during the eccentric part. The eccentric part is typically submaximal. I don't know how much these cost. I would assume it'd be pretty reasonably priced. Maybe one of you could look it up and see how much a couple of weight releasers would cost. Seems like a good tool to have. So let's get into the practical application, force velocity curve. So as I said, for the concentric part, force velocity relationship is inverse, right? So this is the percentage of force. So all the way from 0 to 100%. This is the velocity down here. So this is the force. This line is the force associated with each velocity. So it's not linear, it's more curvilinear, but you can see overall that as velocity goes up, what happens to force? Force goes down. As velocity goes down, force goes up. So that's what we mean about an inverse relationship. So usually in a strength and conditioning program, you want to do exercises that cover all points along the force velocity curve. You have all your bases covered. So athletes have a variety of stressors. Some stressors in their sport are high force, low velocity. Other stressors are more high velocity, lower absolute force. At each point along the curve here, you're still giving 100% exertion. So I don't want you to get the idea that just because at high velocity we're producing lower force, that means we're not giving 100% exertion. We're still exerting ourselves 100%. It's just the contraction is so fast that we get fewer connections between actin and myosin. So that's why force is less, is because at high velocities we have fewer connections between those myofilaments. So practically speaking, what types of things do we do to make sure we're hitting all of these points along the force velocity curve? So high force, low velocity activities, even though our intent should be to move it quickly, so heavy that it'll still be slow velocity. So strength emphasis stuff up here, kind of here in the middle. So moderate force, moderate velocity, again, still 100% exertion. We're looking at our Olympic lifts, Olympic lifting variations. So all your cleans and your snatches, dumbbells, barbells, all those types of lifts. As we get over to more the high velocity, we're getting into plyometrics. Over to this side, this is our usually just body mass, our body weight with speed and agility. So at some point, we hit all of those points along the force velocity curve. We do a variety of exercises to make sure that our bodies are able to respond at all levels of force. Rate of force development, very important concept. This describes how fast force is produced. So we want athletes to be like race cars. We want quick force production. It takes time to go from zero force to maximal force. We're talking in milliseconds, but there's still time that's required. This is a trainable characteristic. We can train our bodies to produce force quicker. So this is where all those speed and plyometric sprint type drills come into play, is learning how to produce force quicker. So a scientific definition of rate of force development is the slope of the torque. You can think of torque and force interchangeably here. Torque time curve from the onset of contraction. So newtons per second. So we have a new force plate in our lab over at the science building. It measures all kinds of variables, and one of them is rate of force development. How fast can you generate force? And in sports, that's really an important variable, because you're talking about fractions of a second to react. It's not always the strongest athlete in absolute terms that wins. It's the athlete that can apply the most force in a very small amount of time. So, practical example, a sprinter. How long is their foot in contact with the ground during each stride? What do you think? It's about 1/10 of a second. So 100 milliseconds, or 1/10 of a second. How much force can you produce in 1/10 of a second? So it's not the strongest that wins necessarily. It's the one that can produce the most force in a very limited time interval. So that brings up the next question: how strong does an athlete need to be in absolute terms? So we can't just continually focus on getting stronger in absolute terms, because if you only have between 1/10 and 2/10 of a second to use that strength, that's all that's really going to count in moving your body. So if you have an athlete that can deadlift 800 pounds, that's great. They're really strong, but you have to question, in the context of their sport, what they're actually doing in their sport, how long do they have to apply that strength? Sometimes they may have enough time where they can generate all 800 pounds of that strength into the ground. Other times, if it's 1 or 2/10 of a second, they may only be able to use a fraction of their strength. So what's really, really important is being able to use the highest percentage of our maximal strength in just a small amount of time. So that's what rate of force development is all about. So just a few numbers for you that comes from your textbook, chapter 4. Development of maximal absolute strength takes greater than 300 milliseconds. So 3/10 of a second to go right from 0 to our max. Okay, but again, if you're a sprinter or other type of athlete, okay, you may not have that much time to push into the ground. Sometimes it has to be a lot faster. So being able to use a greater percentage of your strength is where it's at. So in scientific studies, rate of force is typically examined during the very early, so 30 to 50 or 200 to 300 millisecond time intervals. Okay, so how important is it? So 2013, a study done at Oklahoma State University by Brennan Thompson, and he's now at Utah State University, which is about 8 hours that way. It's useful in predicting starters versus non-starters on a Division I, call it Oklahoma State. Okay, they're a good team. So just that one variable, rate of force development, not strength, not their max, but how fast they can use their strength, was the difference in predicting starters versus non-starters. Okay, elite track and field athletes demonstrated substantially greater V extensor rate of force development during the initial 150 milliseconds. So that's like a race car, going from zero force to maximal force in just a minimal amount of time. So if we look at the torque time curve, you can kind of think of torque as force in this context. So torque is going up over a period of time. So we're talking about from 0 to 100 milliseconds, how much force is being produced. So it looks like we're basically plateauing, getting to maximal force somewhere around 4/10 of a second. But in sports, you may only have half of that. So it's the person that can develop the most torque within that time interval that's going to be the best athlete. So that's what we want, is higher rate of force development. So another practical application. This was a study done in Finland, 1985. They do some great studies over there, especially long-term studies. So how people respond over decades of consistent training. And so this just shows in summary the outcome of the study. You have force and you have time. And so in this study, 3 different groups were compared. So they had an untrained control group. And so you can see in blue for the control group, their force time curve. Heavy resistance trained, so they lifted lots of heavy weights. So actual velocity, pretty slow, heavy lifting. So in purple, you can follow here. And then explosive ballistic train there. Okay, so in black, you can see right here to the end. Okay. So what I really liked about this study is, first of all, it shows how long it took these people to get to their absolute max. So all the way to 500 milliseconds. So that's a half a second. Most groups were starting to plateau. So if you have that long to produce force, which group is the winner? If you have a long time to generate force, yeah, the heavy resistance trained is up here on top, okay? But what if you need quick force production? Ground contact is just that fast. So force at 200 milliseconds, you can compare who's your winner. Yeah, this group right here. Okay. So in a strength program, don't we usually do a combination of both those? We do exercises with lighter weight, with an actual velocity that is really high. We do heavy exercises. So generally we get both types of training, sometimes within the same cycle. Classical periodization generally goes something like this, where early on you are focusing more on heavy, and then as you get closer to the in season and the peaking phase, you're doing more of the explosive ballistic. But there's lots of different periodization type models. Okay, so another study by Brennan Thompson. So he was at Oklahoma State, and then he went to Texas Tech, and then after that he went to Utah State, and he's still there. So barbell deadlift training increases the rate of torque development and vertical jump performance in novices. So even in inexperienced people, you can get positive results from exercises ground-based like deadlifts. So this is just an example from Thompson's study showing pre in the dashed line and post in the solid line. So the point is that for any given time point between 0 and 200 milliseconds, they're producing greater force. So before and after training at around 200 milliseconds, okay, which means they're producing more force in less time. So that's what you want. That's the right direction where you want your people to go. Okay, so let's wrap this up and talk about muscle fiber types. So most of us have a blend of fibers. We have about 50% type 1 slow twitch. We have 50% type 2 fast twitch. Muscle fiber type, just like many other characteristics, approximates a normal curve. So most people, so you take the middle 68% of the bell curve, and most people have about half and half. So why is that an advantage? Just to be an average Joe like Dr. Willardson that has half and half. Why is that a good thing? Let's look at the glass half full. Glass half full point of view. Why is it good to have some of both?
Prepare for various scenarios.
Yeah. So if I want to go jogging, I can go jogging and I can have a good experience. And if I want to do something else like weight training, I can do that and I can have a good experience with that too. So we have some of both types of fibers to fit lots of different activities. Okay, and then we have the extremes of the curve. We call these outliers. So we have these athletes that have almost all slow twitch on one side of the curve. And they can do really incredible things like run 26.2 miles in just over 2 hours. Or I think the record is actually under 2 hours now, unofficially. And you got people on the other side of the curve that have mostly fast twitch, and they can do really incredible things. Okay, like lifting 3 times their body weight overhead for a snatch. So the type of fiber composition that you have tends to be correlated with what sport that you gravitate to or that you're attracted to. So elite athletes, whether they be endurance athletes or strength and power athletes, they tend to have a fiber type composition that fits that sport. In terms of difference between men versus women, it's really not a difference. So there's not one sex or another that has more of slow or more of fast. So we see this in the athletes that compete in sports, endurance athletes with slow twitch, strength and power athletes with fast twitch. I want you to take a look at some of these characteristics here. So color. That's interesting. Color. Type 1 fibers are dark red. What makes type 1 fibers dark red? Has to do with a protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin. Myoglobin carries oxygen in the muscle. Myoglobin carries oxygen to the mitochondria. Versus all the way over here, type 2X fibers are a pale white. So they consist of very little myoglobin. So they're highly fatigable. Dark red fibers are fatigue resistant. So the example that my physiology teacher in college always used to give is, what color is duck meat? Duck meat. It's dark, isn't it? Hey, what do ducks do? They fly. Okay, all right. You eat the meat that's pale white. Chicken, yeah? How well do chickens fly? Not too well. Okay, so that's a practical example of the difference in fiber types. Very fatigue resistant. All of these properties over here describe fibers that are very fatigue resistant. So blood supply is high, mitochondrial density, so that's where we're producing lots of aerobic ATP, myoglobin content, fiber area, so cross-sectional areas is small. If you're someone that was born with a lot of type 1 fibers, you're going to have a hard time putting on a lot of muscle mass. Probably not going to be a Mr. Olympia contestant. You can still increase your size based on effort.
So I have a question. How do you explain people who have, like, they can jump really high, but they don't have a lot of, their legs aren't well developed?
I've seen that. I've seen football players that can jump out of the gym, yet their squat strength and deadlift strength is very little. It has to do with rate of force production. So they have a lot of those fast contracting fibers that can develop force quickly, but they just haven't had the time to apply those fibers into high force activities, is the thing. So 8-time Mr. Olympia, Phil Heath, guess what he did in college? He was a college basketball player at University of Denver. He looked a lot different at that time. He could jump really high, but he didn't look like back then what he looks like now. So they've got the underlying fibers to develop that size and strength, they just haven't applied it yet. So they're looking at fast force production. So if we look at type 2X fibers, shortening velocity, okay, is going to be really fast. So the faster we put force into the ground, the faster the ground puts force back into us, resulting in a really high jump. Okay, power output, force output, both really high. Fatigability is low. These fibers could go forever, whereas it's really high with the type 2X. Okay, contraction and relaxation speed. Contraction and relaxation speed is very high. So sometimes we forget that fast movement depends on a fast contraction, but also on a fast relaxation. So remember, we have to be able to depress the accelerator, quickly put on the brakes, take our foot off the brake, and then push the accelerator again, so to speak. So moving quickly depends on fast contraction, but also fast relaxation. Okay, very last slide. So the textbook does a really good job in this part, the very end of chapter 4, talking about fibers that are deep versus fibers that are superficial. it was nice to review this part, because sometimes you forget that muscles have thickness to it, so you can have some parts, some fibers that are superficial, closer to the surface of the skin, that are different versus fibers that are deeper. And so, take a look, for example, the vastus medialis. Where's the vastus medialis? And so it's on the inside here, one of the quadriceps. I want you to notice surface fibers and deep fibers. Not interesting. The fibers that are closer to the surface for the vastus medialis, you have a much higher percentage on the surface that is explosive type fiber. You go down a little deeper, you go down inside that muscle, down through the fascicles, and you're starting to run into some type 1 fibers, but overall on the surface you have fewer type 1 and more type 2, and then you go deeper, and that's where you get all of the type 1 fibers with the vastus medialis. So on the surface, 43% is type 1. You go down deeper, and you get around 60% is type 1. Deeper would be 38% type 2. So what is the take-home message with this? Well, it has to do with why we do lots of different exercises. So think of how many different exercises and how many different ways we can train the quadriceps. So many different angles and stances and tools we can use to train the quadriceps. The reason we have all these tools is because we can completely develop a muscle by giving it lots of different types of stimuli. If we give the muscle the same type of stress all the time, guess what? After a while, it stops changing. But if we vary the type of stress, some more specific to type 1, some more specific to type 2, we're able to completely develop a muscle all the way from the surface and down into the deeper parts. Okay, so chapter 4 was long, I know. Do you have any questions? Any questions? So, starting on Monday, we're going to get into chapter 6 on the endocrine system. So we're going to talk about how hormone release affects adaptations to strength and power, testosterone, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor, and all those things. So be looking for the article for Monday. I'll post that. And if you have no questions, then have a great weekend. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Quick question on what I might have missed though.
Sure.
The 0.5 to 3 millimoles liters ketosis, is that of
That would put,
ketone bodies?
that would, yes. So that would put you in a mild state of ketosis. Still within a healthy range.
Is there anything else that I missed that was important? I've got what ketosis is, I've got, I understand that it's a high protein, high fat,
Less
low
than
carb.
50 grams of carbs. Takes about 2 to 3 weeks to reach that state.
But I want to try to watch them.
2 to 3 weeks. Okay.
And I'll post a study guide and give you a little more
Oh, yeah.
specific information.
Yeah, to my best friend, had me reading Flex magazine for years, you know what I mean? Like,
Me too.
He would love it. He could talk to you for hours and hours just spitting out. Like Ronnie Coleman was his idol.
Yeah.
But I mean, he could just spit out facts and I mean this and that and probably placements and competitions, you know what I mean, 20 years back, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, whenever you mention stuff like Phil
That's
Heath,
fun.
and, you know, and all that, I'm
Yeah.
like, I think of him immediately. I'm like, yep,
Yeah, back in the day.
that's my buddy.
Bye-bye.
Yep. And he's still a